Hello and welcome to the first ever episode of It's a Mad World. I'm Reagan Connelly, the host. On this podcast, every week we will discuss some crazy news article that is out there in the world. Let's jump right into this week's article, titled California English Teacher Teaches Kids Grammar is Part of White Supremacy. Quote, undermine that BS. This article was written by Hannah Grossman and was published by Fox News. So the overarching theme of this article, as you can tell from the headline there, is that this California teacher has decided that grammar rules are racist. So she instead creates a new curriculum for her class that studies instead the common vernacular of her students, which honestly, in the beginning, kind of sounds like a good idea. Her actual quote on this is, "We study linguistics and the rules that we actually use to communicate, instead of the made-up rules that white supremacy created for when we write papers and stuff," which is what scholars call the language of power. Again, in the beginning, I kind of agree with it. I do think that it would be really fun and really interesting and honestly kind of important to study your own slang terms and your own vernacular and find out why you speak the way that you speak and why you say the words that you say. I think that that's a great idea. However, when you get to the whole grammar rules are created by white supremacy and that kind of thing, that's a little bit where I'm like, no, not really. I mean, every language ever in the history of the world has had grammar rules. There are ways that you're supposed to speak in polite company and in formal settings, and there are ways in which you are not supposed to speak. And this is not just the white people's languages. I mean, I know that Spanish people from Spain are white, but, a lot of Mexicans speak Spanish. Actually, all Mexicans speak Spanish, basically. And Spanish does have a formal language and an informal language. Chinese has a formal language and an informal language. I'm not an expert on African languages, but I'm sure that they have a formal and an informal version. Like, formality is not a Western construct. Formality has been around forever. There are certain ways that you are supposed to speak and act in certain settings. Professional life and private life should be separate. They should not be the same, and that includes language. And I think that's okay. And then another thing that she says is that in her papers, in that quote, she says, instead of using made-up rules that white supremacy created for when we write papers and stuff. Well, here's the thing. Nobody's going to take you seriously if you don't sound serious. Nobody's going to listen to someone who can't separate their slang terms from their professional life. And that's the way it should be. Honestly, I would not listen to me if I spent the whole time talking like a valley girl. In my personal life, those who know me know that I use a lot of slang and a lot of abbreviations all the time. I say BT dubs, I say OMG, I even say LOL out loud when I think something's funny. I use like almost constantly. I do speak like a basic white girl. However, when I'm writing papers and stuff, I know that I have to take that kind of thing out and speak professionally because no one's going to take me seriously if in the middle of my paper I say BT dubs. I low-key hate the feeling and the vibe I get from this author. Like, nobody's going to take me seriously if I talk like that because I sound like an idiot. And that's okay that people will think that I sound like an idiot because I do. So, we have these rules in writing papers for a reason. It's not to be mean or rude or whatever. It's just things are the way that they are for a very good reason. We have reasons for things. The article goes on to say that this teacher, I'm not going to put her name out there because I don't want her to be bullied. I mean, I think she's kind of dumb, but still, I don't think she should be bullied for her ideas. They're garbage ideas, but I don't think anyone should be bullied. Anyway, so this teacher said that the public school system upholds white supremacy, misogyny, and colonization, which we've heard this before a million times. Disclaimer, I am totally against public school. I was homeschooled until high school when I went to public school, and it was fun and I enjoyed it, but more as a socialization thing rather than an education thing. I felt like I didn't learn much in public school that I didn't learn at home already. Her example of how public school systems hold up white supremacy, misogyny, and colonization is that when we write papers, we start with an introduction, you have a thesis, you cite your sources, and you use transition words. Now let's break that down one by one, why we have those things. So, an introduction. Honestly, what else would you start with? I mean, you can't start in the middle of your paper. I wrote a paper last semester about the cultural significance of banshees in the Irish culture. And if I had started in the middle and said, these hired mourners would often wear ragged clothes, walk in the ditches, and were wailing and keening in the late hours of the night. And the sound was the sound of heartbreak and things like that. And if you were a traveler coming down the road and you saw this, you would probably be startled, and thus myths were formed. You would have no idea what I was talking about or why I was talking about it. You have to have an introduction so people know what they're getting into when they start reading your paper. Secondly, the thesis. And that just, again, tells you what your paper is about, what you're going to be arguing. And again, that's important because if you don't have a thesis, then nobody knows what the point of your paper is. You can't have a paper about the cultural significance of banshees without saying the Irish created the myth of the banshee as a way of coping with the inanimate idea of death by attaching it to the animate being of a banshee. You have to have a thesis because if you don't have a thesis, then nobody knows the point of your paper. You're just writing random stuff and nobody cares. Third, citing sources. Now, as a current college student, I can tell you right now, oh my gosh, I hate citing sources so much. It's such a pain, especially when you have one teacher using APA and another one using MLA and another one using Chicago. And there are all these different types of citations and they're all very similar and very different, and the whole thing is a mess. Citing sources is so annoying. It takes forever, especially if you're writing a 10-page paper with like 20 sources, all that stuff. But there's a reason for it, and as much as I hate doing it, I understand the reason. We have to know where you're getting your information and why we should trust you. We can't just take you at your word for it because you're just a person. What do you know? You have to base these things on something else, especially in this setting where she's teaching, I don't know, it didn't say, elementary school or high school or something. That's just a kid. What do kids know? What do I know? I mean, I'm only 20 years old. What do I know about the world? What do I know about ancient history and all of that kind of thing? Instead, I have to hearken to the people who do know. I have to say, well, I know this about banshees because in this document from 1655, it says banshees are this, and I know that it was a widespread and commonly held belief because here is this parish document from County Cork priest who wrote so-and-so died and we knew it because we heard the banshee the night before, which was an actual document that I found, was a priest in a death notice for the parish had written that her death had been preceded by the wailing of her family's banshee. And I can't just say that, I have to prove that that's true, because otherwise anyone can be out here saying any wild thing they want, which I suppose is kind of the point that the left is wanting to happen. They want to be able to just say whatever the heck they want without having to have facts and sources to back them up. But again, that system can't stand on its own. It just, because then you can have contradictory beliefs and nobody knows anything that's going on and everything's a mess and everything is terrible. So you have to cite your sources because otherwise nobody's going to know why they should believe you. And another reason for citing sources is that if I'm reading a paper about banshees or if I'm reading a paper about the NBA, I'm probably interested in that topic and I'm going to want to know more about it. So having those sources that you cited, I can go and find extra materials to learn more about this fascinating topic that I'm reading about. So citing sources is not oppressive in any way. It's a pain, but it's important. Like, it's undeniably important. And finally, the transition words. She particularly has a problem with the transition words however and therefore. I can't make this one make sense to me. Like, all the other ones I can see, yeah, it's a kind of a pain to do or whatever, but like transition words, how is that a problem? You have to have transitions from one idea to another, otherwise it's all going to be choppy and terrible. As for the words however and therefore, what else would you say? Like, if you're going to propose a problem, you should not do so unless you have a proposed solution to the problem. So if you don't like us saying however and therefore because somehow that's misogynistic and terrible and white supremacy and all that, then what do you propose we say instead? I mean, I'm all for finding different words other than however and therefore because those get really repetitive really fast, but like, what else are you going to say? She also says that all of these are just made-up rules, and to that I say, so? Aren't all things in school just made-up rules? I mean, everything in the world really is just a made-up rule. All rules, by their nature, are made up. Somebody made them up somewhere along the line. It's not whether or not something was made up. What's more important is the why. Why was this rule made up? And again, these rules were made up because it's important to have a solid foundation to build upon as a language. And you have to have these rules in place. That way you don't sound like a schlub and you get a job. She also says that slang is just as important and maybe more important than the language of respectability. With this, it's like, okay, yeah, slang is important. It's an important part of your culture. But I wouldn't say that it's more important than speaking professionally and speaking like a person who has a brain in their heads. You know, I'm not saying that anyone who uses slang is an idiot because, again, I am notorious in my personal life for using tons of slang. Both, I think, are equally important. Slang is what makes a society and makes a culture. But you also have to have the professional scholarly language because that's what makes you a professional. That's what makes you an adult. That's what makes you successful in life. Imagine if Einstein had written his theory of relativity in like a Valley Girl. He was like, so like E totally equals MC like squared, like OMJ. Like, nobody would have taken him seriously, and I honestly don't know what the theory of relativity brought to the world because I'm not a math person, but I'm sure it was important, and it was great, and if no one had taken him seriously, we wouldn't have some of the things that we have today. She also said that she worries about being a white savior, which I find very strange, because, like, I understand the concept of a white savior, you know, these poor oppressed black people, and a white person swoops in and saves the day and sets them all free. Which is interesting because that's a concept that is pushed by the Democratic Party. Yet the Democratic Party are a bunch of white people who want to swoop in and save all the poor oppressed black people. But I mean, what do I know? I'm just an idiot 20-year-old Nebraskan girl who doesn't know anything, right? But the point I'm saying here is, how are you swooping in to save poor oppressed black people? By teaching them where to put commas and how to write a paper so that they can get a job in life. I don't think that that's white savior. I think that's just called being a teacher, which is presumably what you went to college for and spent all kinds of money getting a degree to do, and that's what you signed up for, is to teach them grammar rules. I would think, but again, what do I know? In conclusion, these are my ending thoughts. I do like the idea of studying slang. I think it's important to know why we say the things that we say, what they mean, how they started out. I also like the idea of letting them speak in a way that they understand and feel comfortable. I think it's important to let them express their slang in the classroom and speak in a way that makes sense to them, especially when they have to break down concepts that don't make sense to them. But you have to build on that, and that is what I don't like about this. I don't like the idea of obliterating grammar rules simply because they exist. I don't like the idea that just because it's not the way you speak normally, it's bad. That's not the way that the world works. That's not the way the world should work. Yes, teach the kids their slang. Let them use their slang to explain things to you. And then turn it around and teach them how to speak differently. And say, okay, so you understand this concept now. Now explain it again in a professional manner. Because when kids can learn to be professional, they can get jobs and they can make something of themselves and they can express their ideas in a way that everyone who speaks English will understand. I met a guy from Louisiana, and Louisiana is pretty far from Nebraska. And Louisiana has its own culture separate from Nebraska's culture, and therefore Louisiana has a different slang than Nebraska. And when we were talking, just kind of chit-chatting, there were a lot of things that he said that I didn't know because I'm not from Louisiana, I'm from Nebraska. But when I had to proofread this kid's paper, I could understand what he was saying because we were using the same language. And that is so important. When you have so many different cultures, so many different ideas, so many different life experiences, you have to have something that you share so you can understand each other, especially when it comes to the important world of study and scholarliness. I'm pretty sure that's not a word. But like when it comes to actual intellectual conversations where the things you're saying are going to matter and they could potentially change the world in a very dramatic sense. When you're having those conversations, it's important that the people listening to you understand what you're saying. And in the end, that's what frustrates me so much about this, is that we are so focused on being inclusive that we completely obliterate the things that make us united. What happened to being the United States of America, the great American melting pot? It's important to have all these cultures. I really believe that. My family is super, super deep into our culture. And I think that's great. I think it's great when everyone brings their own cultures to the table, as long as we have something that still unites us. And if grammar rules can't unite us, then what can? Thank you so much for tuning into It's a Mad World. I really appreciate you listening. Really excited about finally launching this podcast. So if you made it to the end, you're one of my favorites. Thank you.